What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of the TrineDay Studio Sessions podcast. My name is Scott Armstrong with Rebunk News, and I'm very grateful to be with you all once again today as we are diving deep into the hidden history and disambiguating all of these things that they don't want us to know about. They don't want you to know about. They don't want us to know about it, because when we are armed with this information, we learn more about the world around us. That is not what we were taught. It is not what is intuitive. And with knowledge is power. So we're here with an esteemed panel of guests once again to discuss the incredible new book, Two World Wars and Hitler, Who Was Responsible, from TrineDay Publishing, written by Dr. Jim MacGregor and Dr. John O'Dowd. So very much grateful to be here with you guys. So we have, if you guys have been watching the show, if you guys have been tuning into the last couple episodes, we have a lot of the same heavy hitters once again. Sadly, Chris Milligan won't be here today, but we have with us today, we have both authors. We have Dr. Jim MacGregor, Dr. John O'Dowd. How are you guys doing?
Good. Doing good.
Doing good. All right, cool. And of course, we have Guido Preparata just joined us. Guido, how are you?
Hey, fine, thank you. And how is everybody?
We're fantastic. We're just jumping right in. So
Super.
Thanks for joining us again. And then we have the editor of the book, Terry Boardman, is here. Terry, how are you?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Good to be here. I'm fine. Yeah.
Awesome. Grateful to have you. And then let's see, we have so many people. Professor Richard Spence is here. Hello. Welcome. So these are all of our returning champions. Of course, Timothy Moxley. How you doing? TrineDay Books.
Most excellent. Hello, Scott. Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Glad to be here.
And then Adam Finnegan from TrineDay Books. How's it going?
Yep. Good. Great to be here.
Awesome, man. Now we do have a new guest joining us, and all the way from Deutschland, Andreas Bracher. I'm gonna try. Yep. See, there you go. Andreas, welcome to the show. Can you take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you fit in with this crazy group of historians that, I don't know, they all seem to think they're onto something. Are we onto something here? What is your background?
My background is that I'm also some kind of historian. I mean, it has been my studies, and I've been publishing in history for the last 30 years. So I've published several books which relate especially to the First World War. For example, I've published the papers of the man who was the chief of the German General Staff at the beginning of the First World War, Helmut von Moltke, who was quickly after the beginning, after 6 weeks, he was sort of ousted. But these are materials which really interesting if you understand how did these things really start and what was going on, what were the intentions in Germany by how they acted and all that. So something that I want to say has also prepared me well for being able to appreciate very much what Jim did in this book and also in books before. And yeah, I've other books concerning the First World War. So in general, I've been a writer most of my life in sort of journalistic forms, mostly for a publishing house in Basel, which has an background. And for some time also I edited a journal together with Terry and some lady from Basel. So I guess that is my background for this, if it's okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that fits right into exactly where we're going to start the discussion today. Wrapping up World War I, you guys, we've been moving up through the end of the 19th century into a lot of the empire, and World War I was kind of the culmination of so much of these. The old world kind of ended around that time, and a whole new paradigm was born out of it. So we're going to wrap up World War I. We're going to jump forward and that's going to lead us to future discussions. And when I said earlier, let me clarify, when I said crazy historians, of course, I am saying in terms of what, mainstream, what the textbook writers would have us all be portrayed as the renegades, the ones that, I don't know. But the closer you get to the truth, the more I would say you get called crazy. So that's the crew that I like to be in. So I'm going to kick it over to start off with, actually, with Dr. Jim MacGregor, one of the authors. Now, Jim, where do you see us where we're at in this discussion with World War One, and how would you like to frame it for this discussion?
Thank you, Scott. Before we move on to podcast 4 and the rise of Hitler and the many astonishing things that happened in the 1920s and 30s, thanks to the Milner Group, I think it would be helpful maybe if we could, I could just, maybe in order just to do a little appraisal of what I think the First World War and the fake history was really about. In previous podcasts, we discussed Carroll Quigley's book on the Anglo-American establishment. And in that book, he revealed from the beginning of the 20th century a powerful secret society. He called it the Milner Group, that controlled banking, politics, journalism, education, and much else in Britain and the United States. One of the important things I've been going on about for some time now is through the control of education. Quigley states categorically, they completely monopolized the writing and the teaching of history of their own period, end quote. And he quickly tells us that they achieved this predominantly through the control of education at Oxford University. In two world wars and Hitler, this book we're discussing, we demonstrate how the Milner Group created a fake history to conceal the fact that it was the Milner Group that was responsible for the First World War. I'd like to do a quote from Professor Edward McCullough of Concordia University in Montreal, who wrote, let me see the first quote, the First World War provides the best example of the falsification of history. The false history of the decade before that war is a classic example of the kind of manipulation used to support war. The popular history of Europe in the run-up to 1914 is pure mythology. The false picture of Germany as an aggressive, expansionist disturber of the peace is particularly important for England because of the disastrous results of the policy it followed. So he's basically saying, he's basically agreeing with Quigley that there's a fake history's been produced, and his book came before us, so we're agreeing with him as well as Quigley. And probably the greatest lie about the First World War is that Germany, not England, desired that war, planned that war, and was entirely responsible for starting it. Most people in England believe that to this day, especially the older generations. Perhaps that's not surprising, given that inscribed in stone and war memorials in every village and town and city in Britain is the proclamation that Britain's war dead had fought and died for freedom, civilization, and honor against an evil foe. So that's one of the main. That probably is the main part of the fake history. Germany was responsible for the First World War. Another plank of that fake history is that peace-loving Britain declared war on Germany on 4th of August 1914, purely because German troops had crossed the border into Belgium and thus violated her status as a neutral nation. The English elites declared war that very day with no prior vote or proper discussion in either the cabinet or the British Parliament. They just railroaded it through, basically. the Milner Group with no pretense that the democratic voice had any say in the matter. And this Milner Group, as revealed by Quigley, presented Britain as a noble defender of Belgium's freedom and neutral status against evil German tyranny. And from then on, a massive propaganda drive began in the many British newspapers owned by members of the Milner Group. They called them men. The newspapers called them men aged 19 and over to volunteer for the armed forces. And within just 12 weeks of that initial event on 4th of August, 900,000 young men had been duped, and they enlisted in Britain's standing in the British Army. Now, the British Standing Army at that time stood at just under 250,000 men, 247,000 men, and it suddenly, within a matter of weeks, it increased to well over 1 million. From the turn of the century, the Milner Group had been planning this war. That's the important thing to get across as well to people that think it all happened in the summer of 1914 with the Archduke's assassination in Sarajevo. It didn't. That was just used as an excuse by the Milner Group to get it started. They've been planning this for a long time. They were alarmed at the rapid economic progress of the vibrant Germany. And the Milnerites decided Germany would have to be crushed if their plans for global control was to be realised. Now, again, it was Quigley that said this. They had a plan to control the entire planet. They would do so through the central banks of each country and through the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, they controlled in Basel and Switzerland. Now, the mighty British Navy ruled the waves, as I'm sure we all know, and but Britain alone could never defeat Germany on land. It was just impossible. The massive land armies of France and Russia, they decided, would be needed to do much of the fighting and the dying. So England's erstwhile enemies, France and Russia, were wooed into alliances with Britain in preparation for war. Now, Britain dangled a golden carrot in front of both of them. The French power brokers, if they joined Britain in the war, this carrot offered them, when Germany was defeated, France would regain the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine that she'd lost. She'd lost them in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. In that war, France had started that war. The Prussians defeated them and took the provinces from them. France lost its prime role as the major power in Europe at that time, and Germany thereafter. Well, Prussia merged with various principalities in Germany, small principalities that Germany had been comprised of, and they formed the new German state. That was in 1871, and this new vibrant German state, they were investing heavily in education, colleges, science and technology, and they blossomed. Their economy blossomed, science and technology blossomed, industry blossomed, everything blossomed. And the elites in London, the Milner Group, knew if we don't deal with this, they're going to overtake us, and they would have. The British Empire, by that, Britain and the Empire were beginning to become stagnant, and the power was on the wane at that time. So I think that was the main reason that they decided that in the early stages of the century, this upstart Germany would have to be removed if we wanted to control the world. So when they went to France, many of the powerful men in France were what we call revanchists. They were seriously after revenge against Germany and Prussia for the defeat in 1970, and they were absolutely determined to regain the lost provinces. So when Britain approached them with this golden carrot of regaining the provinces if they joined Britain in war against Germany. They accepted it. They grasped England's hand of friendship immediately. To entice the Tsar in Russia, the golden carrot dangled in front of him was that if Russia joined Britain and France in the war, Russia at the end of the war would be given control of Constantinople. That city is now called Istanbul, for those who might not be familiar with European geography, and it's the largest city in Turkey, and in the country's economic centre. Control of Constantinople would provide Russia and the Black Sea ports with open access through the Dardanelles Straits, that ran through Constantinople into the Sea of Marmaris, and from there into the Mediterranean, and from there to the world's oceans and beyond. But Russia's, for a long time, for centuries, Russia's major ports in the north had all been frozen over in winter. So they were in winter, their exports and imports all crashed basically until the warmer spring weather came in. But if they could gain a warm water port and through the Dardanelles by control of Constantinople, then this would hugely improve Russia's standing in the world. The massive grain markets in southern Russia would be open to the world markets for export and much else. And the Russians, the Tsars, successive Tsars knew this was an absolute dream. So he accepted this proposal. He did it reluctantly to an extent, because he was a good friend of Kaiser Wilhelm. They were cousins, and he liked him, and he liked Germany, and the thought of him ordering Russia into a war with Germany did not sit comfortably at all with him. Now, the thing I want to go on to is about the role of King Edward VII in these creating these alliances and agreements. I've written in notes here, perhaps it's a bit cruel, but the big spending, grossly obese glutton, heavy gambler, and frequenter of elite Paris brothels was heavily in debt to the Rothschild and JP Morgan banks and fully compliant with Milner Group plans. Now, as a constitutional monarch, he should have had no role in democratic government affairs, but of course, as some of us know, democracy was basically a sham in Britain, as it was in many other countries. And the important thing about King Edward, he hated the Kaiser, who was his nephew. He didn't go on well at all, and he began. So Edward went on and started building close links between Britain and the countries that Britain needed to crush Germany. And I think I should emphasize at this point that they intended doing this, crushing Germany, not because Germany was threatening anyone or desired war, but for the stark fact that she was now a thriving commercial, industrial, economic, and imperial competitor. And as I said, it would soon very likely overtake stagnant Britain. So through 1901 and 1902, King Edward charmed his brother, Freemason President Theodore Roosevelt, together with leading Wall Street bankers, and created the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States. Now, that would see the United States supply Britain, France, and to a certain extent Russia with weapons, ammunition, money, and food throughout the coming war, the planned war. And when the time was considered right by the Milner Group, America would join them in the fight against Germany. And that's actually what happened in 1917. Now, Edward schmoozed the French through 1904-05, leading to the Anglo-French agreement, the Entente Cordiale. Then he charmed Russia through 1906-1907, and thus came about what's known as the Triple Entente between Britain, France, and Russia. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know about whatsoever, it's been kept quiet, is that the king also played a major role in encouraging Italy to withdraw from a long-standing alliance with Germany. So by 1908, thanks in great measure to King Edward, the encirclement of Germany with the so-called Ring of Steel was completed. King Edward's prime role in creating the alliances is well recognised by British historians, but they never, that I've seen, all the books that I've read, discuss his important role in drawing Belgium into a top secret alliance. The ties between Belgium and Russia, between Belgium and Britain, had always been close, thanks to long-standing friendships between the British and Belgian royal families. Prince Leopold, the first king of the Belgians, he when he was a prince, he married Princess Charlotte, her name was, and she was a member of the British royal family. And thereafter he was put onto the throne of Belgium as the first king. Belgium was a newly created country back then. Now King Leopold's nephew, Prince Albert, he married Queen Victoria, and his nephew was Prince Albert, who was actually King Edward's father. And so, and there were that's these close relationships between them. In 1906, King Leopold I died, and his son Leopold II took over. He was a man, I'm sure some of you have read the books, that he was responsible for the terrible death and slaughter of millions of black people in the Belgian Congo. They were all sent out to get rubber, bring back rubber, so that he could make a personal fortune from it. And if they didn't bring enough, it was all measured when they come back. And if they didn't, if his men considered that these black people hadn't brought back enough rubber, they simply chopped their hands off. This is what they did. It's to millions of people. There's pictures all over that show this. It's absolutely horrendous. So this is the man that King Edward's making a secret, very secret agreement. And by 1905, it was important because 1905, that's when British, French, and Belgian intelligence came into possession of the German Schlieffen Plan, Germany's defensive plan. It covered Germany's basic defense capabilities. Field Marshal von Schlieffen, he was chief of the General Army Staff from 1892 to 1906. And he calculated that the German defense against a French attack would require an army of 96 divisions. Now, a division at that time varied anything from 15,000 men up to 10,000 men up to 25,000 men. And Germany at that time, he reckoned they would need 96 divisions, but at that time, 1905-06, Germany only had 72 divisions. So the odds against success against a French attack on its own were far from favourable. Now, should Russia join France and attack from the east, as the British elites were long planning and would come about, then Germany faced big, huge problems defending herself against that. France had been in an alliance of sorts with Russia since 1894. It had been ratified in 1894, and part of that agreement was that they would come to each other's defence in a war if the needs arose. Now, Schlieffen set out his thoughts in his memo in early 1906, and that considered a coordinated attack by France and Russia. He believed that a German defence could only succeed if France was rapidly overcome first. And the German forces fighting France, if they've succeeded in overcoming the French, most of them would be moved rapidly, transported back right across Germany to the east to deal with the Russians. The Russian army had a mighty, mighty army. And he decided try and overcome France first, because the massive Russian army was slower to mobilize on the German border than the French would be. So they reckoned they could hold the German forces on the eastern front for some time before they dealt with the French. Now the problem with dealing with the French, first, last, second, whatever, it didn't matter when. The problem to overcoming the French was that they had heavily fortified the the Franco-German border. And so Schlieffen knew that there was very little chance of success if he sent the German troops tried to cross that border into France to deal with. I have to reiterate, this is not Germany setting out. It's an offensive defense. He always believed that defense was the best form. Offense was the best form of defense, and this was we have to go on the attack as soon as they show signs that they're going to invade us. So Schlieffen, because this area in France was so heavily defended, there were German fortresses as well, but French all down from Verdun, from Luxembourg down almost the Swiss border, was very heavily defended. Not quite a short distance. So Schlieffen decided that Germany's only slim chance of success lay if he sent the bulk of the German divisions that were going to attack France, if they sent them through Belgium. And I note here, the German advance across Belgium was not, as British historians have long claimed, proof that Germany initiated a war of European conquest. In reality, it was a defensive move that presented her only chance of success. Britain, and by 1906, as we've seen, they had the Schlieffen plan, and they knew that this would be only Germany's only choice when the British and French started confronting them. So everything basically depended on the German army making rapid progress through Belgium to Paris, and they had to do it. Schlieffen decided they would only succeed if they managed to get to Sweden. If they could reach Paris in 6 weeks. It was a tough call against force.
If I can just jump in for a moment quickly, Jim, is this the attack on the Maginot Line that we're talking about here in France?
No. This is Belgium. Belgium was completely different. There was no real defences built between Germany and Britain, Germany and Belgium, or Belgium and France. So it provided, and I think to a certain extent that was deliberate, because when they were planning this, they wanted the German troops to come through Belgium. So, but unknown to the Germans and virtually everyone else, an Anglo-Belgian military alliance had been formed that totally negated Belgian neutrality. This remained one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the whole First World War. A committee of imperial defence meeting was held in London as early as July 1905 to discuss this, and this was chaired by Lord Disher, who was a close friend of King Edward, and he was his advisor, and he was also a member of the inner core of the Milner Group. This guy was very, very powerful, and he was, again, unconstitutional. He was put in total charge of this committee to prepare for war in Germany. But this was sorting out the Belgian angle. Now they agreed that a special subcommittee would take this forward and joint planning with Belgian military personnel. To maintain secrecy, the minutes of the meetings would not be printed or circulated without special permission of the Prime Minister. It was top secret stuff. The committee decided that immediately the war began, a British force of over 100,000 troops would be sent to Belgium.
Can I chime in just a second?
Of course.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I want to ask Jim, and I wanted to bring in on Andreas in this. The story is that the Germans did this. One of the version is that the Germans could have pulled it off, but von Moltke, the chief of general staff, in one of these accounts, the story. This is the confrontation on the River Marne, right?
Yeah.
Story is that von Moltke freaked out, lost his cool, and that's what compromised their only chance of going into Paris.
Yeah.
And so there's all these interesting, I don't know if they're fantastical stories about conspiratorial innuendos about the fact that von Moltke, this is one, Andreas is an expert on this. Von Moltke was very much under the influence of this Rudolf Steiner. It was one of his spiritual teacher. And they said that Steiner somehow poisoned his mind because he was an ex-theosophist, so pretty much a British agent. And so that's how they made this whole plan sink. Now, it's crazy, but I want to ask both Jim and Andreas, what about von Moltke at the Marne? What's your take on that? What have you resolved about this story?
Yeah, I would just reiterate almost exactly what you said. There's all these fantastic stories are going about, and I've never been able to get my head around this. They said that it was von Schlieffen. They always said you must keep the right wing strong. The forces going through Belgium must be the absolute maximum you can muster for it to succeed in a short time.
I mean,
but I think he changed that about a bit and put some divisions here and put more divisions into controlling blocking off the French border. I think probably the best to get Andreas to give his thoughts on this. He's written books about von Moltke.
Go for it, Andreas. Let's hear.
Okay. I mean, this was the myth in Germany in the interwar years. I mean, von Moltke, he died in 1916, and he was posthumously more and more after the defeat, he was made to be responsible for the defeat because he had blown this Schlieffen thing. And then the whole story with Rudolf Steiner comes in and all that. Although I think it's very clear that the relationship between Moltke and Steiner up to that point was in such a way that there was no discussion of military things or no counseling of military back and forth. The only contact that was in these first weeks of the First World War was that Steiner gave him a meditation, I think, in late August 1914. And yes, the whole thing with the right wing, it's the question, could that have been different? I mean, they say one problem was that the lines were very expanded and the connection between the general staff and the armies which were further up was very weak. In some way, was not very good. So Moltke didn't know exactly what was going on. And he at some stage from messages that he got, he had the feeling he had to draw back some of the troops and sort of order his lines in some more defensive position again. Whether that was the right decision or not, I guess it's difficult to say. Moltke himself later said the only thing that in some way he would say was wrong, or what was his mistake, was that he, during these first weeks, because the Russians were progressing much faster than they had originally projected, that he sent two army corps from the west to the east, so that the west armies, which were supposed to do this Schlieffen Cannae-like thing and go on to Paris, were even a little bit weaker than what was planned at the beginning of the World War. And so maybe that was a mistake, or that's what he himself thought might have been a mistake. But on the other hand, it was these two army corps which made these big victories which they had in the East in late August 1914, this Tannenberg. But
yeah, I think, yeah.
I can't decide this on the military side. I don't think probably that it was almost won and it was a mistake by Moltke, but it was that the lines were stretched out so far that it was into the village, and that they wouldn't be able to conquer Paris in the end.
It just occurs to me that today is exactly the 111th anniversary of the beginning. Today is August 4. And I
At the
think it's
time of the recording,
incredibly
yeah.
appropriate that we're having this discussion and unmasking the deception that has been built up for more than 1 century. And then here you gentlemen are. For me as a
It's the
witness to
beginning.
it, I'm
It's the
honored.
beginning for the British. It's the beginning
Yeah.
for the British,
Yeah.
not the Germans, for example. Yeah, not for all the others.
Yeah, I think if I can if I can go back to Belgium, the importance of Belgium, why I'm concentrating on this is, as we just heard, the 4th of August was the day that Britain entered the First World War. Britain declared war in Germany that day, and it was because, well, the excuse Britain gave for entering the war was because Germany had crossed into the borders of a small neutral country, and Britain, noble, brave Britain, was going to defend this little country. Now, what happened was the committee back then, they decided that a British force of large British force would be sent to Belgium, and an elaborate and detailed plan of the landings and transportation of these British troops took place. And the combined at the time when these top secret talks were going, we know now they were actually talking about the combined Anglo-Belgian forces as being the Allied armies. They were actually saying about the Allied armies. And a series of meetings that were held in London over the years. The perfidy here is just incredible, because the committee of the Imperial Defence was going into such depth. They were discussing the allocation of Belgian officers and interpreters to the British Army, and crucial details, and the care and accommodation of wounded men, and all the time, at every meeting, confidentiality was stressed. They had to keep absolute silence about this. That this was explicitly set out. In 1906, we had a leading British general, Sir Henry Wilson. He later became a field marshal, very senior man in the British Army. And he was, Jerry and I, when we were doing research, we dug into this guy very deeply, and we found very close links between Henry Wilson and members of the Milner Group. He quickly never mentioned him as a member of the group, but we're pretty certain that this guy was very tightly connected to the Milner Group. Now, in 1906, he spent the entire summer of 1906. He took an old bicycle with him. He was dressed incognito, basically in an old sort of peasant's garb and a tent, and he cycled all over Belgium, and he was making notes and clocking everything, all the potential battlefields and all the stuff that would be important when the war did come. So he was doing this, not just that summary, for years he was going on, and almost certainly he would have had assistance covering other parts of Belgium, the parts that he wasn't. So in August, we move on to August 1911, and the Committee of Imperial Defence gathered at Wilson's office. And it's now well recorded that in his office there was a huge map of Belgium in one of the walls. And on this map he had, well, it was all the major roads, railways, side roads, and he'd pinpointed where church steeples were and canals and all that, and stuff that would make good observation points. So they really went into this in incredible depth. And from that point on, when Britain, France, and Russia agreed that Belgium was part of the deal, part of the alliance, Belgium then began to build up her armed forces, and with British and French bank loans, basically. She now spent huge sums of money on a military build-up. In 1912, the Belgian army was expanded to 150,000 men in the field, and it had 60,000 auxiliary troops and 130 in defensive garrisons around the German border. 340,000 men by 1912. This was a gigantic force for a supposedly neutral nation of only around 7.5 million men. In 1913, they introduced compulsory military service in Belgium, and nothing was being left to chance, basically. And at that time, top secret guidebooks were issued by the British Army, the British military, to officers, senior officers and junior officers that would be in the field in Belgium and northeastern France, and they included the detailed maps of Belgium that General Wilson had set out from 1906, church steeples, observation posts, oil depots, roads, everything that would possibly be used in war.
And all of that was achieved with just low-level reconnaissance by these agents. That's amazing.
Yeah,
kind of terrifying in a sense.
Yeah, they did it for years, and they kept. As I say, they just travelled around incognito. They weren't dressed in British military uniforms or anything like that. So this is how they did it. Now, so when they introduced military service in Belgium, the Belgians at that time now had this fairly substantial army, 1/3 men, and they were now told that they could expect from Britain 160,000 men. As soon as the Schlieffen Plan is set in motion and they entered Germany, bang! Britain didn't wait to the 4th of August to start mobilising its troops. The men were marching from all sorts of bases in southern England to the Channel ports to get shipped across to Calais and into Belgium, Zeebrugge and places not long before, but days before. Hours and days in mobilisation of a country's forces was crucial. You'd gain a huge advantage in a couple of days if you mobilised early. And I'd like to just quote what regarding the Russian side. The historian Christopher Clark, he's a well-known British historian, or is he Australian? I can't remember. In March 1913, this is what this historian says. In March 1913, massive sums were approved by the Tsar. This is for the build-up for the Russian side, for artillery and other armaments in a vastly ambitious scheme. As a consequence, the peacetime strength of the Russian army in 1914 was double that of the Germans, at around 1.5 million men, 300,000 more than the combined strength of the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. They were the two allies fighting against all this stuff. And in July 1914, the important thing, the way they got the war started was they mobilised. The Russians were first to mobilise. It was agreed, internationally agreed, an international agreement, but most major powers that if a country ordered the general mobilization of its forces. It meant war. There was no going back. There was no room left for diplomatic negotiations, trying to sort it out. It meant war. You mobilize your forces, that means you're going to attack us. Britain, Russia and France mobilized within a short time of each other before Germany did. Germany was actually the last to mobilize its forces. The Kaiser kept trying to sort the problem out diplomatically. He was writing letters to his cousin the Tsar, the famous Willie Nicky records. What are you doing? This is madness, right? What's going on here? It was only about that time the penny really dropped for the Kaiser, that he'd been totally duped by Britain, absolutely, utterly duped. He hadn't realised that Britain had been organising this for so long, and even in those days, just before when Russia were and France were mobilising on the German borders, east and west, for invasion. Sir Edward Grey, and a famous son of the Milner Group, he was Foreign Secretary. He was sending telegrams to Germany, to the Kaiser. Oh, don't worry. And the Kaiser saying, "Well, are you going to stay neutral? What are you going to do?" And Grey, like they would do in the Second World War, the appeasement and stuff like that. They were playing charades with the Germans. So anyway, and as it turned out, when the Russians started mobilizing in late July, early August on the Eastern Front, Malky, this one Malky we were talking about just recently, just a few minutes ago, he sent 9 divisions east to try and stem the Russian invasion, and the remaining 76 divisions west to face France. And that was about 85 divisions there, just over maybe. Of this force, 54 divisions comprised the right wing that would try and get through supposedly neutral Belgium to Paris. But it meant that even compared to what Schlieffen had been saying 10 years earlier, in 1905-06, that Germany would need 96 divisions to tackle France alone. They were still well short of that, And in the interval, France had dramatically built her army up.
It's fascinating. I was wondering if we could bring in your co-author, John. John, what do you think about all this World War I talk?
Well, Jim's a real expert in this. He's covered all of it. I mean, I think the whole point of what he's saying, though, is it's quite clear that this was pre-planned in huge detail for many years before, with secret alliances, with secret build-ups of troops, with readiness for mobilization, with the connivance of the Belgians, certainly with France and with Russia. And these things were planned ahead, and Germany knew nothing about it. Germany was duped into this through, and a major player in this was the king, who through his relationships with various people throughout the continent was acting essentially as Britain's secret foreign minister, and that he also, because of his connections with the Russian Tsar, and because of his acute dislike, his jealousy, in fact, of the Kaiser, who was a favorite grandson of his mother, and his mother couldn't stand him. Then all these personal things were coming in, but behind it all were the Milner Group and the English, the British elite, and they were planning the whole thing. And I think Jim explained that in a lot of detail there, and others have pointed out the perfidy of it all.
I wonder if maybe Guido can illuminate this further, or perhaps any of our other
I was going to see, also Guido, or I wanted to include Terry and Richard in this too as well. If you guys have any thoughts, please jump in.
I wondered if and then gentlemen, and go ahead and jump in, as Scott said, was England's control of the media and the diplomatic channels so complete that the other countries' ambassadors and all of the other elements were kept in the dark and could be manipulated so thoroughly? Or is it a combination of this and naivete? I just find it shocking, and I would like to get the input of you gentlemen on this.
No, I think the good point. It's a good point, Mox. I think the important players in Russia and in France. I think we discussed this in previous podcast. In Russia, is Volsky. He at that time he was the Russian ambassador in Paris, and Sergei Sassanov. He was the Russian foreign minister based in St. Petersburg. These guys were basically they had been nobbled by the Milner Group. They had been brought in with bribes and all sorts of stuff. And Sassanov was taken to Balmoral Castle for a full week with King Edward's son, King George, and he was treated himself like royalty, and he was brought in and sucked in. And in France, Poincaré and other revanchist members of the French cabinet, they were all convinced in it as well. I'll just finish this and then we can, because this is the important thing. So coming to the Russians and the French started building up their troops. The order of general mobilization started massing on the borders of Germany, France in the west, Russia in the east, massive armies that greatly outnumbered the French forces, the German forces. And Kaiser Wilhelm, he kept, his generals were saying, look, you've got to press the button for the Schlieffen Plan now. If we don't, we're basically defeated before we even make the first move. And he said, no. And he was sending these telegrams to his cousin, oh, we need to try this and try that. And but I think I had a look back to see what Jerry and I wrote about it in Hidden History, and with no other option, the Kaiser eventually initiated the Schlieffen Plan. What else could he have done? Germany was deliberately provoked into a struggle for life or death, and it was akin to bullies goading, threatening and ganging up on a single boy in the school playground. But the moment he had the audacity to defend himself and strike back, he was to blame. And that was basically, the blame was all heaped totally wrongly on Kaiser Wilhelm, because he was left with no option. So as soon as he went in the morning of the 4th of August, Germany had no problems with Britain. They didn't want to fight Britain. They were on good terms. But on the 4th of August, that Monday, that fateful Monday, what was it now, 110 years, whatever it is now, 111 years, the British Foreign Secretary sent an ultimatum to Germany. If she did not respect Belgium's neutrality and remove her troops within the next 12 hours, Britain would declare war on her. No vote was taken in the British Parliament, as I said. The Cabinet never discussed it. The whole thing was just swept through by this cabal, this secret cabal. The British people had no idea what was going on, no inkling of the long-standing secret alliances that had been built over the years by King Edward and others. So when no response came from Germany, the British government issued the following statement. Owing to the summary rejection by the German government of the request made by His Majesty's government for assurances that the neutrality of Belgium will be respected, His Majesty's ambassador to Berlin has received his passports, and His Majesty's government declared to the German government that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany as from 11 p.m. on August 4, 1914. Now, that Britain declared war on Germany, not the other way about. And the lies went on, and the fake history that's generated went on and on, and then they started generating fake lies about the German troops were committing terrible atrocities as they moved through Belgium. Sure, people were killed and buildings get bombed, and that's war. Once you start firing bombs, it's almost unavoidable. But the British propagandists in Wellington House in London, they thought they were thinking up all these terrible atrocity stories they could. The German soldiers were gang raping young girls on the streets in front of their parents, and they were cutting the breasts off nuns. They were dragging nuns out of convents and chopping their breasts off. And German soldiers were going about with their rifles and bayoneting small babies and carrying them about in their bayonets. And they were crucifying soldiers and all the rest of the stuff. And they sent in. There was uproar about this across the world. Of course, what are these people? What are these Germans? What are they like? They're pure evil. It's terrible. When they sent to compound the lies, the Norma Group sent a guy called Lord Bryson, and he did a special report. He supposedly did an independent report on these atrocity stories. And of course, he came out and said, "Yeah, they're all true. I'm afraid it's terrible. There's no doubt about it. It's all true." And this report, all the American newspapers carried it in the front pages. Price had been an ambassador in the US years before, and he was very popular there with the bankers and the elites. Carried his report. German evil in Europe, and this was all done. All these lies and the fake history that followed it was all done to turn public opinion in America into supporting the war. The American public for years had said, "No, we don't want to do with that war. It's nothing to do with this. Keep us isolated from that." And the Bryce report, and then the Lusitania sinking, and a few other things were used to put America. But the whole thing, from beginning to end, is just one litany of massive lies, and the fake history has compounded those lies over the last 100 years. And then when it came to Versailles, the big lie was repeated that Germany was to blame, and Henry Morgenthau, one of the senior Americans, and all American British bankers and all people that were deeply connected with the Milner Group were there. And Henry Morgenthau, he said, "Oh, when I was the ambassador in Constantinople up until 1915, before the Ottomans entered the war, he said the German ambassador came to me and he told me that he was at a meeting in Potsdam, the Kaiser's palace just outside Berlin, and the Kaiser said, 'We're going to start a war, and is everybody with me? Is the banks ready? The money ready? We're going to conquer the world.'" And this utter tripe was presented at the peace talks in Paris as definitive proof that Kaiser Wilhelm was responsible for the First World War. The German delegates, they weren't allowed any evidence, they weren't allowed any witnesses, they weren't allowed to provide any documents, nothing at all. They were just completely blank from the court. And they were told, and then the Anglo-Americans, they signed the war guilt clause, I think, C-231, and blamed Germany.
Can I maybe say something in general about? I think for Germans, very much applies this what one of you
Andreas, just real quick, your camera's off somehow.
My camera.
Yeah. If you go down to the bottom where it says video, maybe that you got to press the video button.
The thing is that I cannot see any of you. I can only see myself.
Oh, weird. Okay, we'll keep going. Just keep going. We'll figure it out.
I'm being phone out from time to time of this. I'm not sure my internet here doesn't seem long enough.
That's fine. I'm somewhere. You're good. Just go ahead. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
For the Germans, they weren't capable to understand what was going on. which was methodically in some way um, in order to get to a situation where it was possible to crush Germany, and they didn't understand why would they do that, and so far they were not completely able to react to that because they were able to, I would say, think on the same level as this British policy was, and that I think more or less something that applies to the whole last century or last 120 years. You can see it similar in Hitler's reaction to the appeasement policy. Or I want to say it's believed in England that all also writes about it in the book. And up to today, with the whole question of the Ukraine war, the complete inability of Germany to react in any way to this blowing up pipeline. Level of this British policy, they cannot understand that. That's why they always walk into a trap. And on the other hand, because this happened in the First World War, some German feeling in the First World War, I think, was like a black wall. They time trying to make some feel some way, and they absolutely no willingness to concede them anything, no willingness to talk with them from equal to equal in any way. Just complete maxim that they have to be crushed, that they have to surrender before anything comes. This experience of
I'm not sure if anyone else is having a similar problem hearing Andreas, but it does remind me that we have to be, particularly in this period of time in history, to be so skeptical of what we hear from the media that assigns blame to the various participants and to the various victims. And I think there can be no more important lesson than to remember what Jim and John have presented to us in terms of the extent that the powers that be will go to in order to manipulate public opinion using all of their elements of control through the media to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Could I just
of course, please, Terry,
introduce this book here to your viewers called The Scaremongers. It was written in 1984. The subtitle is The Advocacy of War and Rearmament, 1896 to 1914 by A.J.A. Morris, a professor at Ulster University at the time. It's a thoroughly excellent study in incredible detail of the propaganda which is so important from the 1890s, from 96 onwards, the eve of the Boer War, the Southern African crisis, to 1914, which shows you how the minds of the British people were controlled by the leading media organs at that time. The mass newspapers like the Daily Mail, Daily Express were created at that time by oligarchs in order specifically, those two in particular, specifically to support the aims of the British Empire. And he especially draws attention to the Berlin correspondent of the Times newspaper. The Times was like the New York Times in the States. The Times of London was, of course, the newspaper for the middle and upper classes, the educated classes, where they got most of their news about foreign affairs from. And they had one guy, George Saunders, who was the key correspondent in the Berlin, the Times correspondent in Berlin, who week after week poured nothing but poison about Germany, all aspects of Germany, into the ears, or rather the eyes of the British reading public. And you can actually see, if you look at the the letters and the writings of Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, how sometimes he even repeats the very phrases that George Saunders had been using in his Times reports from Germany, you see. So today we have exactly the same situation here in Britain, because we have Steve Rosenberg, who is the BBC correspondent in Moscow, and he's been the correspondent there since 2000, if I remember rightly. So 25 years, speaks fluent Russian and so on. But he's been doing exactly the same. Every report before this present crisis started, he has been putting into the ears this time, and the eyes on TV and radio, of the British people nothing but antipathy, poison and hostility against the Russians. So, we have to remember that the media are always, the media is so crucial to how the ordinary folks understand the background context, or don't understand the context, because of course in many respects these people don't even discuss the background context. Yeah? In Britain, the British legalistic mindset of the elite here is usually basically to say, as in 1914, as in 1939, as today, well, the Germans crossed the Belgian border. That's illegal, so we have to go and support. The Germans crossed the Polish border. That's illegal. We have to declare war. The Russians crossed the Ukrainian border. That's illegal. We have to support Ukraine. Without any understanding of the context, which in some cases has gone on for 10 years or more, which has led up to that situation, some of which Jim has already explained to us today.
As the French will often say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Exactement.
There is nothing that is necessarily new. And the idea that Rupert Murdoch, the head of The Sun and other media outlets, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but Rupert Murdoch's great-grandfather was involved as an ambassador or a player within the British elite. And here we are today facing this same machinery that manufactures consent through duplicity. It's good that we know it, but it's a little depressing to see that it continues to this day.
Oh yeah, they perfected the art of that back in the day for sure.
Hey, Scott, can I say something?
Of course, Guido, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree with all the story, the fake news and all that. But there's a part of the story which is also pretty important, both with World War One and with Ukraine today. Although we are in completely different scenarios. I mean, that's World War One. Geopolitics was still a reality. Now, for me, geopolitics is dead since World War II. Now we are what I call Orwellian war games. But some dynamics are similar. These games, I mean, we can talk a lot about how, devilishly clever the British are in doing this, that, and the other, and they've always have been. But none of this would succeed unless you had somebody so, how should I say, naive, in that case, like the Germans, to have done what they did. Because let us not forget that despite all what the British did, they seen from the British viewpoint, they had empire and they had to do whatever it took to protect it. And we saw what they do. I mean, they're ready, kind of like the US in World War II. I mean, they're ready to incinerate the planet, not to let go of it. So I understand that's chilling. But when you got somebody like Germany, in other words, yes, they had the best arts and sciences, and they were a rival that emerged out of nowhere and struck the fear in the hearts of Britain. It certainly did. But then they decided to build a navy, and they started to, they said, well, we want to be an imperial power too. And they went about it without, it seemed, no notion whatsoever what they were doing, because they thought they were going to have some kind of Middle European war, a fast deal. They wanted to fight. That's a problem. And they got a war, but not the war they wanted, and they were crushed. So I guess Germans, think twice, because you went against the rulers of the world, and so they went about it. I don't know how to define it. So completely stupidly. I mean, they were smoked like babies in both wars by people who were far more adept at this game. So when you want to play the game, you got to know what you're doing. And the Germans certainly didn't. So seen from a very cynical vision of power, nothing of this would work unless you had somebody who gives you the opportunity to do that. And Germany was definitely not a pacifist, a peaceable entity. Now, bringing the spotlight over Ukraine. I mean, come on. Do we really think that Putin? I mean, I know none of you believes that Putin is actually real. He is, in the Orwellian framework, he is the guy who's paid to play the villain in the James Bond movie. And so none of this would work unless you have a villain with against whom to play this game. I mean, and we know the fiction. I mean, Russia is it's a British stage. They handed to them in 1917 after they took it from the Tsar. And they even made a funny movie about it. One with Ray Fiennes. It was called The Kingmans or something, where they talk about Rasputin and they send their James Bond to kill him, which is a true story. The James Bond guy was called Oscar Rayner or something like that. And it was a extraordinarily bloody affair. And so these things, so it's Russia's been a British stage, much like the Middle East is British real estate. And so you got to understand this. It's in this work of demonization that we do, we got to be careful. And especially since the end of World War II, it's not the same anymore. And it's a completely different thing. It's a TV production you're watching. So I guess what and I was saying, so it's a British stage. They give it to them. Russia is big as half as the planet, and it has the GDP of Spain. How on earth can you possibly think that they're for real? They're not. So that's the thing. It's not just that you got these. It's not just a player who's devilish. It's the entire setup. And now, especially, it's the whole thing is a game. Before, when geopolitics was still a reality and it was about to die, the British were going to put an end to that with these two world conflicts. I mean, the Germans, despite their brilliance in the arts and science, were politically, as Thorsten Veblen wrote in his amazing books on Imperial Germany, which I've used in essential parts of my book, said they were politically disastrous. And the story of von Moltke, for instance, and all of them inscribes themselves in this. Eventually Germany put herself in the hands of these military that were not equal to the task. And World War One, to talk about today's topic, was very much the end, in a sense, of the game. Right after that, they needed an extra push to finalize it with the Second World War, but that conflict was the one that decided everything. They toppled all the empires, basically much all the rival empires, almost all of them, like toppled and kicked them out of the board one by one. And it took them another 20 years with this second conflict. And after 1945, they have the entire stage, everything. So they have to puppeteer both sides of it, and they keep us entertained with the TV show. And this is what we keep getting, TV series. So I just wanted to make this point. I'm sorry it took so long.
Man. That was fantastic. And it's so true, man. If we can all just take a step back and just realize what we're watching is a production, a show from top to bottom, it's just so crazy. So I want to pass it over and give the final word to Professor Richard Spence. You want to chime in and let us know what your thoughts are on all of these topics that we've been discussing today, or any of your inputs?
Okay. Well, it's been interesting to listen to. I thought what I was might throw into the mix were dismal statistics, because there are lies and there are damn lies and there are statistics. But statistics, one of the things about statistics is that you can have opinions about them, but on their own they don't have opinions. So I always found them interesting things to look at. So what I actually was looking for earlier, if you saw me getting up, wandering around my office, I was looking for a book. I found it. And it's Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And what I find interesting about it are the little charts, little statistics that he has together. And what I'm talking about in particular is on page 202 of Kennedy's book. It's table 18. And it is relative shares of world manufacturing output from 1880 to 1938. And if you look at these numbers, I think they set out in a way what's the kind of inexorable background of what's going on behind these events. Because it comes down to, if the British are intent upon defending their empire, it really means they're intent upon defending their money. That's what it comes down to. Money, wealth, production. So in 1880, according to this chart, Britain controlled, I'm going to round some of these numbers up and down slightly. They controlled 23% of world manufacturing output of stuff that was created, sold around the world. Germany in 1880 controlled 8.5% of world manufacturing output. So Britain's proportion in terms of world manufacturing output in 1880, Britain had about 3 times as much of that as Germany. France had less than 8%, Russia had less than 8%, Austria-Hungary a little over 4%. See, Austria-Hungary is economically almost insignificant. But I have left one country out, and this is where this gets interesting. Number 2, the second largest holder of relative shares of world manufacturing output was the United States, which in 1880 controlled just shy of 15%. So the top 3 were Britain with about 23%, the United States with a little less than 15%, and the Germans with about 8.5%. Now let's skip up to 1900. 20 years later, Britain's share has shrunk. In fact, it will continuously shrink, to give away the whole plot here. It's shrunk now down to 18.5% of world manufacturing output. Germany's has increased to something over 13%. France has actually declined somewhat. Russia's has remained the same. Austria the same. The other big change, the United States has gone from a little less than 15% to 24%. So the US share of world manufacturing output 20 years later in 1900 is now what Britain's was. So the US in 1900 has now become the largest shareholder in world manufacturing output. So let's skip ahead 13 years to 1913, the eve of World War I. Britain's share of world manufacturing output has shrunk to 13.6%, down significantly from what it was before. Germany has now exceeded Britain. It has almost 15%. It has what the US had back in 1880. France, again, 6%, Russia, 8%, Austria, 4%. The United States in 1913, 32% of world manufacturing output. And by the way, this isn't changed after the war. If you skip ahead to 1928, before the Great Depression, after the First World War, well, Britain's share of world manufacturing output has shrunk to less than 10%. Germany's, Weimar Germany's, is between 11 and 12%. France, again, around 6%. Soviet Russia, around 5%. US, 40%. So what this picture shows, or what it suggests to me, is that the British Empire had 2 rivals breathing down its neck in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It was steadily losing its share of manufacturing output. It was also steadily losing its markets. So other countries are taking markets. But if you take this down to the idea that it's a rivalry just between Germany and Britain, and it's the Germans who are the only ones breathing down the British neck, they're the ones who are taking away the markets, That's not the case. This is one of the things that's often forgot is the U.S. is a player and a big player in this. Also keep in mind in this period that the United States, unlike European countries, is not spending any huge amount of money on armaments. They don't. If you look at the size of the U.S. Army prior to World War I, if you look at it right after World War I, it's almost negligible in its size. It had a regular army of less than 150,000 men. It had a fairly good-sized navy, but still no significant army. So there are sort of three players in this game for top position. And the interesting thing to me, well, there are lots of things interesting, but one of the things that's interesting is the different way in which the British approach those two rivals. Because certainly they are aware of them. Certainly there were people in London who were aware of the fact that in 1913, Britain is losing productive power and it's losing markets, but it's losing more of those to the Yankees than it actually is to the Germans. In the case of Germany, as has been sort of laid out here, there is a systematic program of demonization and conflict aimed to curb that threat. But how are the British dealing with the Americans? It's a very different way. They're just as dangerous. I mean, this is what happened in the First World War. The British get the Americans to come into the war to essentially push it to the conclusion that they'd wanted to. And Germany is crushed. It's defeated. The economic rival is seemingly effectively eliminated, but you've just now created an even bigger, you have now enthroned an even greater rival that existed before. So in the case of the British and the Americans, the story there is all about co-opting them. And there are two things that you can do with a rival. You can drag them into a fight they can't win and beat them, or you can seduce them. You can make them an ally in some greater enterprise. And the interesting thing is that if you go back to Cecil Rhodes, the guy whose ideas, crackpot or otherwise, are at the root of all of this, and you look at his attitude towards the US, it was always predicated on this concept, this seemingly fantastic idea of bringing the United States back into the British Empire or back within the imperial sphere. And that, I'd argue, his successors did. Not by bringing the United States directly and politically under the authority of the British Empire, but of creating what is called this special relationship of, for a time, subordinating American interests to those of Britain, of somehow combining the idea that we're all in this together. And that was the way that you dealt. And I think that also shows, if nothing, if not the diabolical, clever, whatever word you want to use for it, approach to this, is that in Germany, it is implacable hostility and destruction. With the Americans, that we can't take on at the same time, the last thing we would ever want to have is to have the Yankees and the Germans together. That's how we will do this. So that's, I think, part of this larger story that hopefully we'll explore as we go on.
Keep our friends close and our enemies, no, keep our enemies close and our friends closer.
You have no friends. Okay. Remember, empires don't have friends, they have interests. Okay. So you now have two potential enemies that you can't fight at the same time. So you destroy one and you become the brother of the other one, or you make them think that they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to talk a bit about, there isn't time now, but I was going to talk a bit about Brooks Adams and Henry Adams.
You can go ahead. Please do. Please do.
If you read the writings of Brooks Adams and Henry Adams, particularly, say, Brooks Adams's book, The Law of Civilization and Decay, 1895, then you see an incredible mindset of how those guys, and they were thoroughly, I mean, they were descendants of the Americans. I think it was the second and sixth president, wasn't it? The Adams family. So they were real East Coast Brahmin types. And that they already had that view back in the 80s and 90s of how America was going to take over from Britain. And that worldview which they had was utterly, utterly remarkable and cynical and based on total power politics. So, I mean, I completely agree with Guido. The Germans were completely naive. They were naive right from the beginning, more or less, right from 1870, even before that, because the Germans turned their backs on their own culture. They basically decided to copy the British. And this is what the Germans do. They copy the people around them, and they're very good at it. They copied French militarism. They copied British navalism. They copied British commercialism and British industrialism to a large degree, right? And they did it superbly. But they turned their backs on the thing that they themselves had to offer to Europe and to the world, which was, that's already been mentioned, the arts, the sciences, the world of culture. The middle classes of Germany, the commercial classes, turned their backs on that. And that takes me to the last point I would like to make, that behind everything that we've talked about, why these elites in these different countries had these different attitudes was the general mood of the Western world from, say, the time of the French Revolution, when nationalism and racism, a racial way of looking at things, a nationalistic way of looking at things, basically took over the minds of the educated classes in particular. So in their different ways, you know, the Russians had their dreams of becoming the third Rome, Moscow becoming the third Rome, and that's why they wanted to take Constantinople. The British, Cecil Rhodes has been mentioned, who wanted to annex the whole universe if he could. The French had their dreams of becoming the culture nation, and revenge has been mentioned. The Italians had their dreams of redeveloping the Roman Empire and so forth. Yeah. But all of that is based on an enormous change which took place at the time of the French Revolution and thereafter, in the decades after, which was this drive to look basically only at oneself. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the loveliest of them all? My people, my tribe, my clan. Yeah, that's what all the Europeans fell for in their different ways. That's what Pan-Slavism was. And that was a poisonous philosophy in Russia, just as the Germans had their own pan-Germanism in a sense, yeah. And the Americans, which is what you read in the writings, particularly of Brooks Adams and Henry Adams, as I mentioned, this utterly cynical neo-Roman Empire, imperial, we are going to control the world. It is inevitable. And they even gave dates. You know, the Adams brothers even reckon, well, by the 1950s, America will be in charge of everything. And so it turned out. So but cultural, philosophical, if you will, background has to be, I think, also taken into consideration. The ideas that were in the heads of the educated classes, the elites who were running the foreign ministries around the world. Yeah. And what Richard's brought with those statistics, that provides a very clear picture of how things were going in terms of the economy and the industries, in terms of the power vectors which underpinned foreign policy. But we also have to take into consideration the dreams that drive people. And history is always a struggle between those people who try to say, oh, well, the dreams are irrelevant. What's important is the money. And then the other people who say, well, oh, it's only it's the dreams that are important. What's the money is just a means to an end. There's always this struggle between historians, between these two approaches. And my answer would obviously be, it's both of them together. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I just say it's the money that pays for the dreams.
Sure. Okay. But the dreams, the question is, when you talk about the money, if you think money is really important, you think that because your mind is in a certain place. That means you have a mental mindset. Where does that mental mindset come from? And I would argue it comes in large part that in the West of Europe and in Europe in general, basically Europe lost its ethical, religious, and spiritual way forward. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, Great.
You
That's
mean
why
basically that when Europeans began thinking of something other than Christendom, yeah, because there wouldn't there were centuries when there was a, for better or for worse, the power of the papacy, for in other words, the power of the church, the idea that there was some kind of single authority beyond those of all. This was the whole struggle between church and state for centuries, is that there were all of these princes and kings who constantly quarreled with each other and tended to be somewhat generally unpleasant, greedy people. And then there was the church, which was the institution ordained by God to actually protect the interests and souls of the population. I'm not saying any of this is true. I'm saying this was the way in which people would perceive it. And that broke down. I mean, one of the things that arguably, once the power of a single church evaporated, once in essence the papacy no longer had the power to dictate to kings and emperors and princes, it just became the kings and emperors and princes, and more than likely the assorted parasitic advisors they had around them. That's
yeah,
this
yeah, and then it became
nation. Yeah.
then it became the economists and the bankers. Exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to quote to you one thing here from the English journalist and also occultist William Thomas Stead, who was worked very closely with Cecil Rhodes. Yeah,
Mhm.
he wrote in 1889 something called Letters from the Vatican in the Pall Mall Gazette, which were published as a book under the title Letters from the Vatican, the Pope and the New Era. The Pope at that time was Leo XIII, and Leo XIV, the current American Pope, is on record as saying he's given himself his name with Leo XIII in mind. Very important Pope. And in this book, Stead writes that he recommended to the Vatican that if it still wanted to play a role in the future new order, which was in the hands of the English-speaking peoples now, he said, quote, the papacy must be occidentalized, anglicized, or Americanized. Indeed, the Pope himself has to think English. Rome is the old world, archaic, dying, passing away. The center, the capital, and the mother city of the new world, which Catholicism must conquer because otherwise it will perish, is not to be found on the banks of the Tiber, but on those of the Thames. Of course, now we could say the Potomac. Yeah. So this is a guy who already had a very long-range vision of how what you just described, Richard, about the powers of the papacy, the medieval worldview. All of that has been passing over to the commercial financial interests, which Brooks and Adams writes about in The Law of Civilization and Decay, that the old chivalric medieval feudal worldview of the nobility, of the aristocracy, which still governs so much of Europe in 1900, that is passing over to the guys of the statistics, the guys of the banks, the guys of commerce and industry, and that's centered above all in the materialistic culture of Britain. So he was somebody who really had his finger on the pulse, I think. And it's interesting that in 1887, I'd just like to flag that up as a final point. 1887 to 1907 is the 20-year period when the British changed their foreign policy completely, when they exchanged their former friends of the 19th century, Germany and Austria, and turned their former enemies, France and Russia, into their former friends. And the price for doing that was to sacrifice Germany, Guido, because that was the price that both the French and the Russian Panslavists wanted to be paid. And the British elite decided, well, we cannot get on in the world in terms of power politics if both the French and the Russians are against us. The Russians were getting stronger all the time, and France is still a force. With the Russians and the French against us, we cannot go forward. And then we have the Americans coming up economically. And as Richard's already said, the British decided to get into bed with the Americans, literally. I think between 1870 and 1914, about 150, 170 rich American heiresses literally jumped into bed with cash poor British aristocrats, right? And of course, the number one of them product was Winston Churchill, yeah, who most British tend to forget is half American. So you know, the British saw that we have to make this change. And the date when they began to make that change was 1887. And I would really recommend your viewers look into the events, economic events, mining events, South Africa gold and diamonds, yeah, Cecil Rhodes, all of that. But also the financial events which are taking place in Europe with what the Rothschilds were doing, with the way that the British and the French and the Russians and the Germans were changing their relations at that time. And the British then decided, we're going to have to sacrifice the Turks and we're going to have to sacrifice the Germans in order to keep in with the French and the Russians with regard to Europe and India. And with regard to the world, we're going to have to get in with the Americans. Otherwise, we don't go forward in the 20th century. That was the gamble they made. And of course, they came out of it really badly in the end.
Right on. Well, gentlemen, that's quite a bit for the audience to chew on. I think that's a fantastic, fantastic discussion. So much information. And of course, all of you listening out there, if you want more information about this, please make sure you go purchase the brand new amazing book, Two World Wars and Hitler, Who Was Responsible? All these topics are explored in more depth, and just so cool to have this conversation to bring, shine further light on some of these really, really important topics. So if you go to TrineDay.com, make sure you go to TrineDay.com and purchase the book yourself. Get one for your aunt, your grandma, your friends, anybody you think that might benefit from this knowledge. And of course, make sure you share the show. Share the show with others. Make sure that this information is able to proliferate, because the truth is we're all moving towards truth at a rapid pace, and these discussions help inch us that much further every step of the way. So I want to thank all of you so much for joining us once again. It's just so awesome to hang out with all of these incredible minds who have all of these amazing perspectives. I learn so much every single time. And thank you all very much. And until next time, my name is Scott Armstrong with Rebunk News. This has been TrineDay Studio Sessions, and we'll see you next time. Peace.